It started like any normal morning. I stepped outside, coffee in hand, ready to check the yard and enjoy the peace that came with early daylight. But as I turned the corner of my house, I froze. A tall, metal fence now cut through part of my land, a section I use almost daily. It wasn't there the day before. No note on my door. No phone call. No email. Just this huge silver barrier staring me down, with a sign that read Property of HOA, do not enter. I blinked, thinking maybe I was mistaken. Maybe I had forgotten about some construction or some maintenance update I missed. But no, this was my property, land I paid for, land I mowed, cleaned, and used. And now, someone else had claimed it overnight. My first reaction was confusion, not even anger, just a flood of questions rushing through my mind. Why? How? Who gave permission for this? I hadn't received a single warning. I hadn't even spoken to anyone from the HOA in months. They never mentioned a thing. No letters. No calls. Nothing. Just a fence, standing cold and quiet, where it absolutely shouldn't be. I tried to open the gate, thinking maybe it was just some kind of temporary setup. It was locked. A thick chain wrapped to the handles, and a padlock that looked brand new. That's when it really hit me. Someone had gone out of their way to block this area, and they wanted it to stay blocked. And they didn't even bother telling me. Now, you might wonder why I didn't call the police. Why not just remove the fence myself? Trust me, that crossed my mind more than once. But I know how these things go. You mess with HOA property, even if it's on your land, and suddenly you're the one getting fined. Or worse, dragged into some messy legal situation that takes months to resolve. So I held back, for the moment. Instead, I started walking around the fence, trying to see exactly how far it stretched. That's when I noticed something even stranger. The fence didn't just cut off one corner of my yard. It wrapped around a narrow strip that led straight to the back edge of my lot, a part one rarely used since it backed into a hill. I hadn't thought much about it, but now I was curious. Why block off that specific area? It was almost like they were trying to keep me out of something. I remember my grandfather mentioning that our land used to be part of an old estate, long before the neighborhood was developed. He used to say there were stories of old passages underground, used during the Prohibition era. I had always laughed it off as just a family myth. But standing there, looking at the way the fence was positioned, so precise, so oddly shaped, I began to wonder, what if there was something back there? Something they didn't want to find? My heart started racing a little. I walked around to the side of the house, where I kept my tools. I grabbed a flashlight and started toward the edge of the yard, beyond the fence's reach. There was a path, mostly overgrown, but still visible. I hadn't walked it in years. At the very end, behind a line of brush, I saw it, a small dip in the ground, covered by an old wooden hatch, the kind you'd never notice unless you were looking for it. I knelt down and cleared some debris. The hatch creaked as I lifted it. Beneath it, a short ladder dropped into the dark. The air was musty, but still. I clicked on the flashlight, and what I saw made me step back. A tunnel, not just a hole or an old drain pipe, a full, stone-walled tunnel, wide enough for a person to walk through. It stretched into the darkness, sloping slightly downward, and the direction it pointed? Straight under the fenced-off part of my land. I didn't know what I was looking at, but one thing was clear. Someone else did. Someone knew it was there, and they were trying very hard to keep me away from it. Years ago, when I first bought this house, I was told the land had character. That was the word the realtor used, character. At the time, I didn't think much of it. The lot was bigger than most in the neighborhood, with a narrow stretch that dipped behind some trees, away from view. It wasn't perfect, but it was quiet, and it felt like mine. That was all I cared about. I signed the paperwork, moved in, and for years, I lived without problems. The HOA barely contacted me, aside from the usual newsletters about lawn care and holiday decorations. I paid the fees. I followed the rules. There was never any tension. That's why the sudden fencing felt like such a slap in the face. No warning, no notice, just a physical wall between me and part of my own property. But to really understand how strange this was, you have to know the layout. My house sits near the end of a cul-de-sac. It's older than most of the homes around it, built decades before the HOA even existed. Most of the other lots are boxed in, neat and predictable. Mine isn't. There's this narrow tail of land, like a forgotten trail, that curves out behind the yard. It stretches right to the edge of a wooded slope, with nothing but brush and rocks beyond it. Most people wouldn't even know that strip belonged to me. But I knew. It's on my deed. It's marked clearly. That land is mine. When I first moved in, I cleared a little, trimmed the overgrowth, set some stones to line the path, but after a while, I let it be. It was private, hidden. Honestly, I kind of like that. It gave the place a certain mystery. The HOA had never shown interest in it, not once in over 5 years. Then suddenly, a fence. And not just any fence. Tall, metal, anchored deep into the ground. Whoever put it up didn't do it in a rush. This was planned, approved by someone, paid for by someone. And I wasn't part of that conversation. I started asking around. I went to my neighbors first. Some of them hadn't even noticed the fence until I pointed it out. A couple of them seemed uncomfortable, like they knew more than they wanted to say. One older guy, Tom, leaned in and whispered, "They've been eyeing that back patch for a while. Said it might be part of a future green space or something." Future green space? On my land? I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was happening. That this wasn't just about fencing. It felt like they were trying to erase the fact that I ever owned that part of the yard. Like it was never mine to begin with. I went digging. I pulled out the original survey papers from when I bought the house. I compared them to the HOA's boundary maps. There was a clear difference. A narrow slice of land, about 15 feet wide and 60 feet long, excluded from the HOA's domain. That was my tale, my forgotten trail. So why were they acting like it was theirs? I tried to reach out to the HOA, called them, emailed, left messages. No response. The office was closed for maintenance. I even went to one of their so-called community meetings. But when I brought up the fence, the room went quiet. A couple of board members exchanged glances, then quickly moved to the next agenda item. It was like I wasn't even there. That's when I knew they were hiding something. And that brings me back to the tunnel. I hadn't thought about it in years. The hatch was old, the wood warped and soft. But as I stood there, staring down into the darkness, I knew this was the piece they didn't want me to find. I knew now why the fence was so carefully placed. It covered the only known surface access to whatever was buried under my land. So I climbed down. The ladder groaned under my weight, but it held. My flashlight cut through the dark, revealing stone walls lined with brick. Dust floated in the air, undisturbed for who knows how long. I took a few steps forward. The tunnel curved slightly to the left, just enough to hide what was ahead. And right then, for the first time, I wasn't just angry. I was curious, really curious, because I had a feeling that whatever was down here, it wasn't supposed to be found. The air got colder the deeper I went. The walls of the tunnel were solid, built with care, not just some random hole in the ground. It felt old but strong. Whoever built it knew what they were doing. My flashlight beam bounced off stone, catching small glimmers of something in the cracks. At first, I thought it was just moisture, but some of it sparkled like metal. I kept walking, slow and careful. My steps echoed softly, and every sound felt louder than it should. I passed through a narrow archway, where the tunnel widened slightly. There were markings on the walls, not graffiti, but carved symbols, faded letters. I didn't recognize the language, but it didn't look modern. Nothing about this place felt modern. It was as if I had stepped out of my backyard and into another time. Then I noticed something odd. On the left side of the tunnel, near the base of the wall, was a wooden crate, not ancient. Dusty, yes, but not falling apart. The hinges were rusted, but intact. I crouched down and gently lifted the lid. Inside were several glass bottles tightly corked and filled with a dark liquid. A thin label hung loosely from one of them. I wiped away the dust. The label read 1932. It hit me all at once. This tunnel was used during Prohibition. My grandfather's stories, The ones I used to laugh off, they were real. This wasn't just a passageway. It was a smuggling route, maybe even a storage room for bootleggers. And right now, part was buried under the very land the HOA had just fenced off. Now I understood why they didn't want me near it. I stood up, trying to steady my thoughts. Who else knew about this? Someone had to. You don't just accidentally fence off a part of land that happens to hide a secret tunnel from the 1930s. This was intentional. They wanted it sealed, forgotten, out of sight. But I wasn't ready to leave yet. Farther down the tunnel, I spotted a newer-looking door. Metal, not wood. Clean edges. There were scratch marks around the handle, like someone had tried to force it open. I pressed my hand against it, cold and heavy. I gave it a push. Nothing. Locked tight. I stepped back and looked around. That's when I saw another set of footprints in the dust. Not mine. They were faint, but definitely there. Someone had been down here recently. The dust wasn't fully settled. It looked like they came from the direction of the metal door and then turned around. Maybe they didn't have a key. I followed the footprints back toward where I had entered. Halfway there, something else caught my eye. A panel embedded in the tunnel wall. It was metal too, but covered in dirt and nearly invisible unless you were right next to it. I brushed it clean with my hand. A tiny keyhole stared back at me. The kind of keyhole that looks like it belongs in an old desk drawer. Small, almost forgotten. So now I had two mysteries, a locked door and a hidden keyhole, neither of which I could open. Yet, back at the surface, the sun had started to set. The fence stood tall as ever, silent and still. But now I looked at it differently. Not just as a violation, but as a cover-up. Someone knew what was buried under that strip of land. Someone went through a lot of trouble to keep it hidden. And when they realized I might stumble across it, they acted fast. I walked around the perimeter again, slower this time, looking for anything I had missed before. A few feet from the back fence post, I noticed a small flag staked into the ground. One of those orange survey flags. I leaned down to read the tag tied to it. It said Utility Marker, Survey Line A. That didn't make sense. There were no active utility lines back there. At least, none I was ever told about. The last time a survey team came through was over a decade ago. I never requested one. So, who did? And more importantly, why now? As I stood there, trying to piece everything together, I heard a soft click behind me. I turned fast. The gate in the fence had swung open a few inches. No one was there. No movement. No wind. Just a gate, slowly creaking as it moved. Someone had been watching. Maybe still was. I didn't move right away. The gate stood slightly ajar, swaying just enough to make a soft creaking noise that echoed in the still air. My first thought was that maybe it hadn't been locked properly. But I had checked it myself the day before. It was shut tight, chained, padlocked. Now the chain was gone, not on the ground, not hanging from the gate, just gone. I stepped closer, slowly. My pulse picked up, but I kept quiet. No sudden moves. I glanced around, looking past the tree line and toward the neighboring yards. No one was outside. No dogs barking. Nothing. It was like the whole street was holding its breath. I pushed the gate open with the tip of my foot. It groaned on its hinges. I half expected someone to jump out or a camera flash to pop, but nothing happened. Just silence. I stepped through. The fenced-off area was exactly how I remembered it. Narrow, sloped, with a patch of uneven ground leading to the far end of my property. But now that I was inside the fence, it felt different. Heavier, as if this space had its own atmosphere. Like it had been holding a secret for a long time and didn't want to give it up. I started toward the spot where the tunnel ran underneath. I knew roughly where it would line up based on where I entered it. As I got closer, the ground beneath my boots felt a little softer, like it had been disturbed recently. I crouched down and brushed my hand across the dirt. There were subtle lines in the soil, not shovel marks exactly, more like pressure, as if something heavy had been moved across it. I stood up and scanned the area again. That's when I saw it, another small marker. This one was different. A thin, black plastic stake, barely poking out from the dirt. No tag this time, just a red stripe painted around the top. I had no idea what it meant, but it didn't look like any marker I'd seen before. It looked deliberate. I pulled my phone out and took a picture. Then I noticed something strange. My phone signal had dropped. Completely. No bars. No Wi-Fi. Just a blank screen where the signal strength should be. I hadn't moved that far from the house, but somehow this fenced-off patch was a dead zone. I tried calm myself down. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe the slope or the tree cover was interfering. But deep down, I didn't believe that. Not anymore. Not after the tunnel. Not after the old bottles. Not after the gate had somehow unlocked itself. I decided to head back to the hatch and take another look underground. As I moved, I kept glancing behind me. Still no sign of anyone, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left. If anything, it was stronger now. Back at the hatch, I reached the lid, but stopped. There were fresh scuff marks on the wood. Dust knocked loose. Someone had opened it after I did. Or maybe they were already down there when I first went in. I gripped the edge and pulled the hatch open. The ladder was still there, still sturdy. I aimed my flashlight down and paused. The air that came up smelled different, less musty, like it had been stirred recently. I climbed down slowly, each step echoing off the stone. The tunnel was darker this time. The dust seemed more unsettled. I moved carefully, eyes darting between the walls and the ground. When I reached the spot where the wooden crate had been, it was gone. Completely. Not moved, gone. No glass bottles. No broken wood. Just an empty patch of ground and a trail of disturbed dust leading toward the metal door. I followed the trail, heart pounding. At the door, I noticed something that hadn't been there before, a tiny scratch on the wall, just beside the handle. 3 short lines, carved into the stone. They looked like initials. Whoever had come down here had left a mark. Not much, but enough. Enough to tell me they wanted me to know they'd been here. I turned back, trying to keep calm. I hadn't heard anyone, hadn't seen anything, but the pieces were falling into place. The fence, the fake utility markers, the erased crate. Someone was trying to erase this place, erase the past. And now that I had seen it, now that I had stepped inside the truth, they weren't just hiding it from me anymore. They were watching to see what I'd do next. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the house, every shift of wind outside the window felt like a signal. I kept checking the yard from my bedroom, hoping to catch someone, something, anything that could explain what was going on. But all I saw was that fence, standing there like it always had, acting like it belonged. By morning, I was done waiting. I made coffee, grabbed my phone, and took a fresh notepad. If someone was going to keep tabs on me, then I'd start keeping tabs on them. I wanted names, dates, documents, anything that would prove this land was mine, and that whatever they were hiding down there wasn't just a forgotten tunnel, but something they were actively trying to cover up. First stop was the county records office. It's not exactly a fast-moving place, but after a few hours of waiting and explaining my situation, I got what I needed. Property lines, survey history, deed transfers, pages of it. And every single one confirmed the same thing. The land behind my house, the fence strip, the tunnel underneath, it was all legally part of my lot. Not the HOAs, not the cities. Mine. But here's where it got strange. I found a record of a property inspection from 3 years ago, an entry that didn't show up on my personal copy of the property history. It listed a routine inspection by a third-party surveyor contracted by the HOA. No notice, no contact with me, and no clear reason given. Just a note. Rear lot line observed. Unusual terrain access noted. That's it. No follow-up. No attached map. Just that one sentence buried in a long list of permits and tax reports. Someone had known about the tunnel for at least 3 years, and they never told me. I took copies of everything. Photos. Scans. I even highlighted the line about the unusual terrain access. It wasn't much, but it was something. A crack in their story. I was halfway home when I noticed a dark SUV parked at the far end of the street. It wasn't familiar. No stickers, no tags, no one inside that I could see. Just parked there, angled slightly toward my house. I drove past slow, try not to make it obvious I was watching. When I looked in my mirror a minute later, it was gone. That night, I went back down into the tunnel. I waited until it was late, really late, after midnight. I didn't turn on any lights outside. I didn't make noise. I just lifted the hatch, climbed down the ladder, and started walking. I brought more light this time. 2 flashlights and a small headlamp. I wasn't taking chances. The tunnel looked the same. The dust, the walls, even the strange scratch marks were still there. But I noticed something else now. The temperature. It was colder than it had been before. And not just underground cold. It felt forced, artificial, like air conditioning or maybe airflow from somewhere deeper. The metal door was still locked. No movement, no sound. But this time I listened closer, and I heard it a low hum, barely audible, like a machine running behind a thick wall. It wasn't coming from the door, though. It was coming from behind the wall, to the left of it, a place where the tunnel wall seemed solid, but just slightly off. A different kind of stone, maybe newer. I knocked. Hollow. I stood there a while, trying to figure out my next move. I didn't have tools. I didn't want to damage anything. Not yet, but I marked the wall. Just a small scratch with my key. If it changed, if it disappeared the next time I came back, I'd know for sure someone else had been there. As I turned to leave, I caught a faint smell. Oil? Gasoline? Something chemical. It was gone as fast as it came, like a gust from deep inside the tunnel had pushed it out for just a second. Back at the surface, I noticed something on the fence post near the gate. A sticker. Brand new. Bright orange. It hadn't been there before. Property access restricted. Code 743B. Removal prohibited. No name. No HOA logo. Just that warning. Placed right at eye level. They knew I was getting close. I stared at the sticker, reading those words over and over again. Code 743B. It sounded official, like something a government agency would slap onto a locked building or a seal file. But this wasn't a facility. It wasn't a hazard zone. It was my backyard, my land. And that code, I had never seen it on anything HOA related before. I took a photo of the sticker and peeled it off. Underneath, the post was clean, no dust, no residue, which meant it had been placed there recently. Probably that day, maybe even while I was down in the tunnel. The idea that someone had walked on my property and marked it without me knowing sent a cold rush down my spine. They weren't being subtle anymore. I went inside, pulled the blinds, and started digging. I searched everything I could think of, legal code databases, county zoning ordinances, even obscure HOA bylaws I had downloaded years ago and forgotten about. Nothing. No mention of 743B. Not as a law. Not as a building code. Not even in police enforcement jargon. Then I stumbled across something that made me stop. It was on a forum for urban explorers. People who map tunnels, abandoned buildings, old train routes. Someone had posted about a 743B tag they found under an old library schedule for demolition. The post said it wasn't a city marker, but something used by private site reclamation teams. Whatever that meant, the replies were scattered, mostly dismissive. But a few hinted that the code wasn't public knowledge, that it was tied to companies who operate under contracts. Contracts. That word stuck with me. I pulled out the inspection note again, the one from 3 years ago that mentioned a third-party surveyor. It didn't list a company name, just initials. VDC. I searched that too. Most results were unrelated. But buried deep in an archive construction listing, I found a reference. Vantage Development and Compliance. They did site planning, underground hazard inspections, and this part hit hard, special zoning evaluations for high-risk private developments. I called the number listed, but it was disconnected. I tried another, from a cache page on a permit filing site. This time, it rang once, then went dead. They didn't want to be found. The next day, I took a walk around the neighborhood. Tried to see the fence, the land, the slope, all from different angles. Maybe someone else had noticed something. Maybe someone had a different perspective. That's when I ran into an older neighbor a few blocks over. Her name was Ruth. She'd lived in the area since before the HOA was even formed. I asked if she remembered anything unusual about the land behind my house. She squinted, then nodded slowly. "Oh, that bit of land," she said. "Used to be off limits when we were kids. Parents said it belonged to the county once. Something about a storage vault or a cold room. Never saw anything, but folks always said it wasn't just dirt back there." I pressed her for more, but that's all she had. A vault, though, that was new. That was different from just a tunnel. It sounded bigger, built for something. That night, I couldn't shake the thought of what might be behind that hollow wall. What were they trying to keep in or out? I decided to test something. I bought a cheap trail camera, the kind hunters use to track deer. I set it up just inside the fence, pointing toward the hatch. I wanted to see if anyone came back while I was gone. I left it running overnight, camouflaged with some leaves and positioned just right. The next morning I checked the footage. At 2:13 a.m., the motion sensor was triggered. A figure appeared on the edge of the frame. No face, no light, just a shadow, walking slowly, deliberately toward the hatch. They crouched for a few seconds, maybe checking the lock. Then they stood and walked off toward the trees. Less than a minute total. But in that minute, one thing stood out. They were wearing gloves and a patch on their jacket, barely visible in the grainy infrared. A triangle with 3 letters under it. VDC. The same initials from the inspection. The same initials from the forum. Someone from that group had come back. Maybe to check the hatch. Maybe to seal it. Maybe to make sure I wasn't still asking questions. I copied the footage and saved it in 3 different places. They thought this was over. They thought I'd walk away. But I had a feeling they were just getting started. I didn't leave the house for the rest of the day. Not because I was scared. At least not exactly. But because I didn't want to miss anything. If they came back, I wanted to be there. I wanted to see them. Face to face, if it came to that. But the hours passed slow and nothing happened. Just the fence, the trees, the silent weight of a secret pressing down on my backyard like a storm waiting to break. By late afternoon, I decided it was time to take the next step. I danced around the truth long enough. I had to know what was behind that wall. I went back into the tunnel with more than just flashlights. I brought a crowbar, a small hammer, and a mason's chisel. I had no idea how thick that wall was or what I'd find on the other side, but I wasn't walking away now. Every part of me buzzed with tension. Not fear, not quite excitement, but that strange middle ground where you're too far in to stop and too deep to turn around. The tunnel was colder than before. The air tasted metallic, like the smell of old blood or wet iron. I didn't stop at the crate spot. I didn't even look at the door. I went straight to the left wall, the one I had marked with my key the night before. The scratch was gone. Not faded, not chipped, gone. The wall was clean, as if it had never been touched. Someone had come down here again after I left. Maybe they thought I wouldn't notice. Maybe they wanted me to. Either way, that sealed it for me. I pulled out the crowbar and started gently testing the edge of the stone where the sound had echoed hollow the night before. It took a few tries before I found the weak point. A small crack, nearly invisible, just wide enough to wedge the chisel into. It took me almost an hour, but eventually the stone loosened. When it finally gave way, it didn't fall. It slid back with a soft scrape, like it was made to move. Behind it was nothing at first, just blackness. I aimed the flashlight into the space and nearly dropped it. It wasn't a wall I'd broken through. It was a door, a real, sealed, heavy-duty vault door, circular, with a thick wheel in the center, something you'd see in a submarine or a bank, and stenciled across the front, faded but still legible, were 4 words. Authorized entry only, V.D.C. This wasn't old. This wasn't leftover from the 1930s. This was modern, and someone had installed it inside a tunnel no one was supposed to know existed. I ran my hand across the steel. Cold as ice. No keypad. No handle except the wheel. It looked locked, but it didn't feel like it had been closed from this side. I hesitated, then gripped the wheel with both hands and pulled. It groaned, Rust and time resisted me, but slowly the wheel began to turn. One full rotation, then another, then a heavy mechanical click echoed to the tunnel like a shot. I stepped back. The door cracked open a sliver, enough to let out a rush of air, dry, stale, heavy with dust. I pushed it open wider and pointed the light inside. It wasn't just a room. It was a chamber, a space carved into the earth, maybe 15 feet wide, lined with shelves and crates. Some wooden, others metal. Most sealed, but not all. One of them had burst open, revealing old papers, blueprints, files, faded black and white photographs. I stepped inside, heart hammering in my chest. The air felt wrong, like time didn't work the same in here. I grabbed the nearest photo. It showed a large, rectangular hole in the ground. Men in hard hats stood around it, looking down. But what they were looking at wasn't clear. The photo had been scratched deliberately right over the center of the image. Next to it was a file folder. The front was stamped with red ink. Classified, Site 12B. I flipped it open. Schematics, diagrams of underground structures. Tunnels branching off in all directions. Some labeled with coordinates, others marked as inactive. But one label was clear. Main access, residential overlay, Zone 4. That was my house. I didn't take anything. Not yet. I just stood there, trying to breathe, trying to make sense of it. I hadn't just found a forgotten bootlegger's tunnel or some abandoned root cellar. This was something else. This was a buried installation, a planned hidden facility, and I had stumbled into the heart of it. Then I heard the vault door start to move behind me. Slowly, quietly. Someone else was in the tunnel. I didn't turn around right away. For a few seconds, I just stood there, frozen in place, listening to the slow scrape of metal as the vault door began to close behind me. Every instinct in my body screamed to run, to stop it from sealing me in. But another part of me, the part that had come this far, told me to stay still, stay quiet, and see what happened next. The door didn't shut completely. It stopped a few inches short of locking, like whoever was outside had changed their mind at the last second. I waited, barely breathing, flashlight still aimed at the row of crates and documents in front of me. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, careful, deliberate. They weren't trying to be quiet. They wanted me to know they were there. I finally turned toward the door, but the light caught nothing, just the edge of the steel, a sliver of the tunnel beyond, and shadows. Whoever it was stayed out of sight, waiting, watching. I stepped back from the vault's edge and moved deeper into the chamber, into the rows of metal storage units lining the far wall. I ducked behind one, light off now, trying to let my eyes adjust to the dark. My heart thudded against my ribs like a drum. The footsteps came closer, and then they stopped. Silence. I waited. Still silence. And then, softly from the other side of the door, "You weren't supposed to come down here." A man's voice, calm, almost tired, not angry, not surprised, just resigned. I didn't answer. I wasn't even sure he was talking to me. After a moment, he spoke again. "You think this is some kind of mystery you can solve with a flashlight and a crowbar? This place isn't a secret because someone forgot about it. It's hidden because it has to be." That's when I finally spoke. My voice cracked a little. Then why fence it off without warning? Why mark it with a fake code? Why not just say what it is? Silence again. Then a deep sigh. Because no one believes the truth when it sounds like fiction. I stepped out from behind the crate, keeping the flashlight low. "Then tell me. Start with what's behind those tunnels on the map. What was Site 12B? He didn't answer. Instead, I heard a small beep, like a handheld device powering up, and a red light blinked on the corner of the chamber. Not from my side. From behind the shelves. I turned to it. A camera. Small, modern, and definitely recording. The man's voice came back, this time clearer, like it was coming from a speaker in the wall. "You want answers? Fine. But not now. Not here. This isn't the place for it." I walked closer to the camera. "Then where? You'll find the next entrance soon. It won't be marked. But when you see it, you'll know. Until then." The light blinked off. The voice cut out, and the footsteps faded. I stood there, completely alone again. It took me a while to move, to breathe normally, to understand that somehow I hadn't just found something forbidden. I had been allowed to find it. And whatever this was, whatever they were doing here, they weren't done with me. I turned back to the crates. Something about them felt different now, less like relics and more like bait, like pieces of a story they wanted me to follow, but only so far. I opened one of the smaller boxes. Inside were files, but these were newer, printed on fresh paper. And the name on the first folder nearly knocked the air out of me. It was my name, not just a mention, a full file. Photos of my house, satellite images, copies of my emails, social media activity, even surveillance screenshots from inside my own backyard, dated, stamped, and filed neatly under a label. Zone 4 subject, unawareness status, terminated. Terminated? I flipped the page. There was a checklist. Tunnels accessed, yes. Unauthorized door breached, yes. Contact initiated, yes. Last item, ready for relocation protocol, status, pending. I dropped the file. I wasn't just being watched. I was being handled,